First, given my sour disposition, I'd like to make a complaint. This is the second time in about a week that I've been asked to participate in a panel dealing with issues about the 21st century, and I'm a historian. So, I deal with dead people who basically thought it was a great time to take their kids, to watch somebody being disemboweled. So I'll give this a shot. Now, what is masculinity? Masculinity is not something that we can touch or feel. It is not tangible. It is a set of concepts about how men should look and behave. There's nothing natural or real to it. And just as behavior and ossified expectations don't always agree, every age in society inevitably leaves behind an idealized form of masculinity. Just like we leave behind an all-soft when we move, or sort of a bad one-night stand that we'd rather forget about. And you end up getting more appropriate forms, newer forms of masculinity that better reflect the behavior and the ethos of a certain age as we change. So as new generations of men dress, move, speak, they perform manhood in new ways, different from those of their fathers. The lived reality of masculinity, therefore, stretches further and further away from an idealized, brittle concept. If masculinity was a person, it would be very depressing, right? Because it seems as if it's always fighting a losing battle, always dissolving into memory and having newer, hipper, younger masculinities taking its place. It's like, Tom Cruise trying to remain relevant. And there's so much Botox you can put on your face, but you'll still be yesterday's or last century's news. So the one good thing about being a historian, however, is that it gives me a bit of distance, right? And I can try to figure out the forest from the trees. So let me give you an example from the time period I studied, the 1600s. There used to be sort of this old martial type of medieval masculinity, right? Where noble men were knights, where on one hand they had a mace where they could crack a skull, on the other hand they had eating a chicken leg that wasn't seasoned, and they could get dirty in the process. That was all the better. But by the time we get into the 1600s, what's happening is that you have court life developing, and the king doesn't need knights anymore to fight his battles. You get basically noble men becoming bureaucrats and the like. So you can see that the roles that are expected of them as men, as masculine, are changing over time, right? And certainly at that time, what's interesting is also that women, for example, have much more access to power, right? If you don't need to fight to show your power, your prowess, anymore, well, you can do it through political intrigue, through court life and the like. So I would argue in a way that we see a very similar process happening today. The masculinity of our parents or grandparents' generation is no longer relevant. It doesn't really fit how we live our lives. 40 or 50 years ago, it was still very common for men to be breadwinners, for women to be homemakers. For example, if any man in my family would go to my grandmother and say, can we help you out in the kitchen, she would swat us in the head and say something to the effect that, men work, women cook, and women serve them. But God bless her soul, she grew up in a time when that made sense to her. Yesterday, I was coming to Bishops and I was listening to the radio, and I heard about a new book, right, that's been just published, where a female author argues, for example, that women in the States, in America, are actually becoming the breadwinners in that nation. And she actually shows that, for example, about 40% of married women actually are earning higher salaries than their husbands, right? So things are changing today, and these shifting gender relations, when we speak of culture, economics, society, basically make the old forms of masculinity that were held by our forefathers impossible to maintain. Now, the more visible way in which this crisis of masculinity plays out is, I would argue, on the body itself. So, you know, we have the phenomenon of metrosexuals, right? Who, if you ask someone of my father's generation, they would say, well, you know, these guys are crazy, right? We also have, I was reading the other day on the New York Times that there's this new fad of men wearing pantyhose, all right? It's called mantyhose. So, I would argue that men are ultimately crafting and performing new types of masculinity. And perhaps ones that will become the acceptable standard in, you know, 30, 40 years. So if social interactions and culture were constant, perhaps masculinity wouldn't change. But if you give me an unchanging society, I could give you $1 million. It's extremely improbable. Maybe you had sort of some hunter-gatherer groups that, you know, remained in sort of a Neolithic technological stage. The changes we've seen in the last 40 years, women's lib movement, the sexual revolution, the LGBT rights movement, as they have moved along, they have made the old forms of masculinity increasingly irrelevant. The crisis of masculinity is basically the cries, the complaints you hear from those hearkening back to a different age, as contemporary men adjust to new circumstances and perform new types of masculinity. It is as inevitable in changing post-modern societies as the sun rising in the east. A crisis of masculinity is a feature, it is not a bug. And for us, it is the changing gender relations that have dealt the death blow to old forms of masculinity. What we see as a crisis is really just the last dying gasps of masculinity already in the dustbin of history. Thank you.
So I just wanted to point out, as long as we're giving disclaimers, that I'm actually a classicist, which makes me even further back. So. Okay. Judith Gardner, professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and pioneer of gender and women's studies, argued that this so-called crisis of masculinity is actually, quote, a crisis of patriarchal entitlement. In other words, boys, that's the sound of the world's smallest violin playing just for you. But is there something else going on here? Are there issues at play that cannot be dismissed out of hand with this kind of flippant remark, like the one I just made? It seems to me that there are, but that none of these issues point directly to a crisis of masculinity in the 21st century. So in the interest of time, I will discuss only 3 of the myriad issues which plague men in contemporary society, namely the prolongation of childhood or adolescence, the problem of a discourse of hegemonic masculinity, and the indisputable fact that men are no strangers to negotiating their gender in the broader scope of society. So much of the debate about the perceived crisis in masculinity ought instead to be focused on age. It is painfully clear that both boys and girls are staying younger longer, refusing to accept the mantle of responsibility for as long as possible. While school used to be a time to leave the nest, that nest is often remaining well-feathered throughout and sometimes even after graduation from university. The term helicopter parent, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but this was coined to describe the latest generation of parents whose inability to cut the apron strings, if you'll excuse my anti-feminist expression, keep their kids from growing up. Harvard, for example, which for many years has hosted an orientation assembly for both students and parents, was forced to add a recessional parade complete with bagpipes to escort parents out of the orientation assembly because none of the parents could take the hint that it was time to leave their kids the hell alone. So that's just a little inroad on the adolescence debate. My esteemed colleague here has already discussed some of the problems of definitions, as has Taylor. Crisis, for example, and of course masculinity. So it seems to me that the perceived crisis of masculinity is not really about masculinity, but about hegemonic masculinity. So what do I mean by hegemonic masculinity? Well, Stu's, cover your ears. According to Wikipedia, which I don't hegemonic masculinity reflects, quote, a belief in a culturally normative ideal of male behavior, end quote. In other words, it tells us that there is a way to be a man. This so-called ideal of male behavior inevitably includes such fun-loving characteristics as violence, aggression, the will to dominate, and unapologetic ambition. Thinking and talking about masculinity in this way creates a monolithic category to which men either belong or do not, and a society which either accepts them or does not. Certainly, feminist movements have done wonderful work towards rejecting the form of masculinity which props up patriarchy and therefore male power, though of course there is still a lot to be done. But is it right to suggest that all men are suffering from a crisis due to this perceived loss of power? When we say that men are suffering from a crisis of masculinity, which men are we talking about? White men, black men, rich men, poor men, gay men, trans men, bisexual men, monogamous men, polyamorous men, fathers, bachelors, the underemployed, those at the top of their game, athletes, hipsters, musicians? It is a fallacy, if you'll pardon the pun. It is a fallacy that men are all the same. And all we have to do is look around to prove it. If we define masculinity in a hegemonic fashion, then it's easy to find men who fall short. If we define masculinity broadly, it is easy to find examples of men who find themselves as far from crisis as could be imagined. This problematic concept of masculinity is something that men in the gay, bisexual, and transgender communities have recognized and rejected for years. That masculinity is not a monolithic concept, and it is certainly not the purview of heterosexual males in single-earner homes with multiple dependents. But more importantly, while masculinity studies, in other words, putting a name to the situation, is a relatively new addition to the academic arena, asking questions about what it means to be a man is not new, even for those men who do seem to fit the description of hegemonic masculinity. So after the Second World War, for example, which my friend Taylor over here already mentioned, men did come back to a new world. Women had been working their jobs. They didn't see where they fit anymore. In the Second World War, they also plumbed the depths of what it meant to be a man, engaging in and bearing witness on the battlefield to what is the absolute worst in men. But we all know how 1950s America solved that problem. They paved over it by sending women back into the home and applying a thin veneer of well-cut suits and aftershave commercials to this negotiation. Those of you familiar with Mad Men will recognize the character of Don Draper as being constantly engaged in a struggle of what it is to be a man, and he fails at nearly every turn. And he's not the first one to feel this way. The Emperor Nero, for example, burned down most of Rome and then built a palace and a colossal statue of himself in its place. Can you say inferiority complex? Napoleon is perhaps the first and most famous example of short man syndrome. Even though my liberal arts class told me that he wasn't actually short. But Shakespeare's Macbeth also struggles to assert his manhood in public while enduring a constant barrage of emasculating criticism by his wife. The negotiation of a man's role in society, then, is not specific to the 21st century. In fact, it is a key part of what it means to be a man, just as ongoing negotiation of womanhood is central of what it means to be a woman. What has changed in the 21st century is the creation of a vocabulary and a discourse used to discuss the anxiety, fear, and insecurity which have always been felt by men. A refusal to be bound by limiting mythologies that entrench men in roles that are no longer reflective of their position in society at large is not a crisis. It's called progress. Thank you.
Well, Jenn, you want to start? Or?
No, go ahead.
So the question to me is then, well, if it's always in crisis, what are the specific factors that have led to the current crisis of masculinity?
I think, I mean, I don't want to be too pedantic here, but I'm a little confused about the concept of something being always in crisis. If something is always in crisis, is that not simply a facet of its nature? A crisis is, you know, as we've defined on both sides, I think, is a sort of acute set of circumstances that precipitates a particular set of responses.
The problem is that you're sort of dealing with both prescription and behavior, right? Sort of idealized expectations and assumptions about what it is to be a man versus actual lived behavior, which can never quite fit that, right?
Right.
So in certain ages you might have a prevailing discourse or assumption or expectation about manhood or masculinity that fits with the times, but as you get socioeconomic changes, cultural changes and the like, then people are just going to be behaving in ways that just don't quite fit with that any longer.
And even the example of 40% of women making more than their husbands, this might be true in dollars, but when you look at the actual organization of gender and power in the workplace in North America, it's still overwhelmingly male-dominated. Almost like over 90% of boards, for example, and over 90% of CEO and upper management positions are still held by men. So if women are finding a way to make the dollars without the title, bully for them, but to me, the way that the system is still set up, it continues to reinforce that male power. So I guess I just don't really see
certainly.
where that loss
But
is.
it's a question. I mean, look at the phenomenon of, you know, man caves, right? What is that? I mean, you know, back in the 50s and 60s, men didn't need to have a man cave because their whole household was their cave. Now they feel that they have to have this separate space where they can kind of, you know, celebrate, take refuge, celebrate their masculinity and sort of what it means to be a man away from their wives. So there are some anxieties there, I think, and we cannot discount them.
Right, no, and I wouldn't dream of discounting male anxiety. I didn't mean that to be insulting. But I mean, even the example of a man cave, I think that the which men are we talking about question is still really important, because this whole conversation about men in crisis is pretty limited to the upper middle class white male, because arguably, you know, there are a lot of race and class-based arguments that you could make that there's no man cave in the offing. I mean, there's no house, or there's no sort of stable income or relationship to negotiate. So I feel like the sort of harridan wife and the man cave to escape it is such a limited model to work with in defining male crisis. So I feel some resistance.
Well, yeah, I mean, you cannot separate gender from class, race, and other factors, right? So men are not just men, women are not just women, they're part of much broader categories as well. So it's honestly, we can separate them, but it doesn't mean that we're not seeing anxieties related to manhood itself and how it should be performed, how men should dress and the like.
I think that fundamentally we do see things conceptually very similarly, but I think I still have to.
Maybe we should have been on the same team.
Would never saw my teammate down the river. But I still have an issue with the 21st century part of the crisis question. And even the argument that it's the women's lib movement or feminism. I mean, this has been going on for a really long time, you guys. Like, this isn't the last decade that women decided to do some stuff. You know? Like, it's been happening for a long time. So I just don't see how that is precipitating a crisis that is any different from any of the other anxieties or crises that have been experienced in the past.
Yeah, I think sort of.
This is going to be a battle for the last word, isn't it?
I'll let you have the last word. I'll be a gentleman. I'll let you have the last word.
Well, now I don't know what to say.
About gender, I was wondering why you were hooking up masculinity with just pure males. Because in gender and society in the 21st century, there is a gray scale.
I studied the 16th century, right? So one of the most famous inquisitorial trials of that day was of a woman who was pretending to be a man, right? She was probably a hermaphrodite. And all the issues that came up during that trial related to this quote-unquote woman attempting to perform masculinity, right? So although I didn't mention sort of this in-between status, I think it plays a great role in shaping and crafting the anxieties around what it means to be a man. The overall point that we were trying to make is in some ways very similar to what the other team was saying, right? Sort of this notion of the ambiguity of masculinity, the sense that masculinity itself is always in crisis. However, the difference is that we're arguing that if masculinity is in crisis across time, and indeed today, that ultimately the factors that led to the crisis today are mostly demographic, socioeconomic, changing gender relations, the greater power of women in the household and outside of it. And we see these reflected in anxieties about the masculine body itself.
That was very good. That was 41 seconds. Team No Crisis.
Okay, I think ours is even going to be shorter. But in closing, we argue that the so-called crisis in masculinity is the reflection not of a new set of fears for men, but rather the product of a new way of talking about them and talking about gender relations. In other words, it isn't men that have changed, it's the way we think about men that is changing. So I think my partner here and I have made apparent the fact that this perceived crisis is nothing more than so much pissing in the wind.
Okay, so we now have the opportunity to vote. After you've listened to both sides, the arguments, the evidence, they have invoked your ethos, your logos, your pathos. They have tried to scare you, cajole you, and even at some points flatter you. You are now going to make a decision based on who you believe argued most persuasively. So I'll read the proposition again. The proposition is men in the 21st century are suffering from a crisis of masculinity as they attempt to negotiate shifting gender relations. For those of you who are in favor of that proposition and that team, please clap now. Okay, and for those of you who believe, in fact, there is no crisis of masculinity in the 21st century, and the team who has argued for that has been persuasive, please clap now. I love to state the obvious, but the team that has argued against a crisis has won. Congratulations, and thank you to both